Hey now, NecroVMX here with another SNES review, this time being of a game that you may have played. Maybe you didn't beat it, or if you haven't played it, you probably heard a lot of bad things about it, but, well, I always give games a fair shake and I have my own opinions. This time, I'll be covering the 7th Saga. I should mention that despite its name, it's not in any way connected to Saga, Romancing Saga, or Saga Frontier. As a matter of fact, this game wasn't even made by Square. It was developed by Produce and published by Enix long before they merged with Square, and in Japan the 7th Saga is known as Elnard. In this case, you pick one of 7 heroes from drastically different backgrounds, but all with one thing in common: being raised and trained by a wise and benevolent king who sends you out looking for the mystic arcs, though in the American version they're called runes. The game is known for one thing, and one thing only in the United States: the punishing and unfair difficulty. If you ever tried this game, you probably got your butt handed to you within minutes by the most basic of enemies, and even with copious amounts of grinding, struggled through the game until you either gave up or eventually triumphed. But most likely gave up because this game pulls no punches and pretty much hates you. However, did you know that the unfair, brutal difficulty is a frickin' glitch? Yeah. And not only that, but it was a glitch that wasn't present in the Japanese release. Basically, Elnard was a challenging but fair game, but when localizing the game, some errors were made that caused enemies to be at a much higher level than they were intended to, and stat growth for the characters was slowed down considerably. Not only that, but even in the original game, magic was glitched. It worked as intended, but magically inclined characters had their stat growth stunted. They weren't as powerful at the endgame as the developers intended them to be. So, there's a few options here. You could play the raw version of the game as it was released in the United States, and suffer immensely. Or you could use a special fan-made patch that fixes one or both of these issues. The 7th Saga difficulty patch fixes the localization-caused glitch and makes the game play like its Japanese counterpart Elnard. There's also the optional part of the patch that fixes the magic glitch. What I chose is to fix the difficulty to match the Japanese version, but I didn't use the magic patch. My reasoning being that the glitch was present in the Japanese version. When thinking about eventually reviewing the game, it's weird to review what is essentially a ROM hack. But by not using the magic patch, I could just basically review the Japanese version. So, for all intents and purposes, I am reviewing the Japanese version of the game, Elnard. But I'm using the official translation. I will, however, comment on the difficulty of the unpatched American ROM, but my score for difficulty and balance, as well as the final score, is based solely on this patch, so keep that in mind. That being said, I will be reviewing the 7th Saga on a scale from 1 to 10 in the following categories: graphics and gameplay, music and sound effects, story and writing, gameplay and controls, and balance and difficulty. Visually, the 7th Saga is an interesting creature, as how striking it is to you depends on whether or not you saw it at the time. The 7th Saga makes copious use of Mode 7. That's the SNES's way of handling rotation and scaling of background layers. Mode 7 doesn't look like much today, at least not to someone who has seen 3D effects done in other ways. But at the time, it was quite impressive, and if you know a little bit about game design, such as I do, it's still rather impressive. No one but Nintendo has ever really figured out how it works. I used to work for an indie gaming company who made PC games, and in one of our titles we used an effect that's very similar to Mode 7, only to find that the graphics processing requirement skyrocketed when using this effect. It required the most beefy of graphics cards just to run the Mode 7 effect at a decent frame rate, something that both the SNES and the Game Boy Advance do smoothly. You ever play Mega Man 7? If you played it on any other system other than the SNES, such as PlayStation 2 as a part of the Mega Man Anniversary Collection, or any of the modern systems including Steam, you may notice that there's an entire scene missing from the ending. Why? Because on the SNES, Mega Man 7 used Mode 7 for that scene, something that modern computers struggle to do well unless they're specifically emulating the SNES ROM. So yeah, Mode 7 is something that I still think is really cool and impressive even today. That being said, the 7th Saga looks kinda awesome. Not only is the entire overworld rendered in Mode 7, but every time you get into a battle, it essentially creates a battle background on the fly by rotating and scaling the overworld. It saves on art assets as they didn't have to draw art for each area, it just turns the location that you're in into the battle background. You're just playing from a different perspective. Unfortunately, this doesn't apply to dungeons, which aren't rendered in Mode 7, so the battle scenes are pitch black, though this actually struck a chord with me. Perhaps nostalgia for the old NES Dragon Quest games. The sprites aren't bad, there's good animation of your characters attacking and using skills and spells in battle, and the same goes for the enemies, some of which are pretty freaky and have good animations. It doesn't look as impressive as something like Treasure of the Rudras with its fluid character and enemy animations, but keep in mind the 7th Saga came out in 1993, alongside the likes of Lufia or Romancing Saga 2, which didn't have as much animation. The 7th Saga favors darker colors, but not necessarily duller colors. It just sorta has a grimy aesthetic that works well for the game's feel. The game's presentation sadly lags a bit, with what I consider to be a poor font choice for the text both in and out of the menus, and the menus themselves being kinda bare bones, with a lot of transparency that means that how easy the text is to read depends on where you are. The other thing on the HUD at all times is your crystal ball, which acts like a radar and a mini-map. This is also partially transparent, though this is a good thing since it's pretty big and you wouldn't want it covering up too much of the screen. Though I would have liked to have been able to adjust the HUD's opacity, I guess that's a bit too much to ask for a SNES game from 1993. That being said, overall, I find the 7th Saga to be attractive, mostly for its use of Mode 7, and for the great enemy designs and good animation. Considering the time it came out, I'd like it to have a better HUD, but that's really kind of a personal nitpick for graphics and presentation. I give the 7th Saga an 8 out of 10. For music and sound effects, sadly, the 7th Saga doesn't do a lot that's all that's interesting. There's a few good songs in the game, particularly regular and boss battle themes, and the overworld's forlorn sort of theme works well, but there's not a lot of musical variety to the game. The songs that are there are fine, but they repeat way too often. The sound effects, on the other hand, are kind of a nightmare. There's a few good sound effects for casting magic or slicing up enemies, and there's a lot of innocuous little beeps that are used in the menu. Sadly, this beep is also reused for a lot of different things, such as opening doors. Why, oh why, do doors beep at me when they're opened? Once again, it's not so much a lack of quality as it is a lack of quantity. There's so few sound effects in the game that they get reused, and using a menu beep to signify a door opening is something that I would expect from a computer RPG from the mid-80s, not something on the SNES with its great sound chip, and especially not from an Enix-published game. There are a few bops in the soundtrack, but overall there's only about an hour's worth of music here. I was actually surprised to see that there's just a shade under an hour's worth of music in the game because I honestly thought it was less. But that seems to be because some songs are tailored to what character you're playing as, which is cool and all, but that means that you won't hear a lot of the soundtrack in one playthrough. So while the full soundtrack is only a few scant minutes shorter than Lufia, you have to play the game 7 times to hear every song. For music and sound effects, I give the 7th Saga a 5 out of 10. The songs are above average despite there being so few, but the sound effects bring the score way down. It's really just an average experience for sound overall. For story and writing, this game seems pretty bare bones at first. You're introduced to the king, who has apparently raised you and trained you, as well as the other 6 characters that you're not playing as. And you're just told to go find the runes, or mystic arcs if you're playing the Japanese version. You go from place to place, reaching a town, solving some sort of issue, and then getting one of the arcs. Seems really linear and straightforward, but it's not about what you do, it's about how you do it. Firstly, the other 6 characters don't vanish after the intro. They're all on the same quest as you are, so they also move from town to town doing the same things that you are. They also have their own motivations, though some of them are kind of thin. All of their actions tend to be guided by that motivation, and how the characters relate to you is based on which character you are, who they are. For example, there's a demon character that you can play as, and no one really likes this guy because he's just kind of a jerk. So it takes a lot more for other characters to want to help you if you play as him. If you're not playing as him, since he's such a jerk, he's more likely to be hostile to you. The other characters can join your party, they can talk cordially with you, they can tell you where to stick it, or they can even attack you. If you get attacked by one of the other heroes and lose, you'll lose all of your runes and you won't get them back until you defeat that hero. If a character joins you, they may stick with you for the entire game, but they may also decide to betray you and steal your runes. Some characters are more likely to do this than others, though there's two that will never betray you, the Priestess and the Iron Giant. You also may find that upon reaching where a rune should be, that someone else beat you to it, and you'll have to go find that hero that got to the rune first and attack them to get the rune back. You can only have one companion, but you can change that companion if someone else wants to join you. You can switch as often as you like, as long as the character that you're switching to is still alive and hasn't gone hostile towards you. There's also a part where one of the heroes will become evil and take over a town, and they will be a boss battle. So even if you avoid talking to the others, you'll find yourself in conflict with at least one of them. Of course, once you pass that point, that hero is gone forever and can't be recruited, so if you want someone specific, you'll want to court them early, though sometimes they may not like you enough and you'll have to keep progressing until they do. It's a pretty complex system, and the plot itself also kicks into high gear once you retrieve all the runes. I don't want to say any spoilers, but let's just say the entire thing isn't as generic and straightforward as it is at first glance. It's a storyline that goes from being a typical town-to-town RPG to something that actually can make you think a little bit, which is pretty impressive for 1993. Comparing it to 1993's other major US released turn-based RPGs, Lufia, the writing is nowhere near that level. The text is all rather simplistic and short, but the story itself is pretty wild and unique. Lufia went for a very fresh take on an old and tired formula. It elevated the basic RPG plot, whereas the 7th Saga subverts it. It's two different but equally impressive things. The only thing stopping me from giving it really as high of a score as Lufia is that the writing isn't as impressive. It's mostly impressive for the way that it subverts expectations rather than its actual script. For story and writing, I give the 7th Saga a 9 out of 10. For gameplay and controls, this is a pretty simple game. You get a crystal ball early on that acts as your mini-map and radar. You can see enemy encounters on the radar, so you can kinda either avoid them a bit if you need to, or walk towards them if you want a battle. Though the enemies can walk through walls and over water on the radar, so if you're trying to avoid them, it's not as easy as you might think. The radar also functions in dungeons to find unopened chests, and on the overworld it will highlight towns and castles, and best of all, glowing bright dots where the runes are, which is important if the rune you needed was taken by another hero. You can find the hero more easily. Battles are a standard turn-based affair, though with a higher emphasis on using items, particularly the runes, which all have a purpose. One may act as a warp spell, another may raise your attack in battle, another may raise your defense, and yet another may heal you. Getting from place to place is pretty easy, even though some dungeons are maze-like. The radar helps a lot with this, though you may sometimes randomly find an alternate exit to a dungeon and be shunted out of it. And these are usually only one way, forcing you to start over. Regardless of whether you play the Japanese or the American version, you'll fight a lot of battles, so thankfully the battles themselves are rather fun, with a few tweaks that make it unique for its time, such as spells cast by both yourself and the enemies being dodgeable, or visible life bars for the enemies. And due to the straightforward progression, you rarely don't know where to go next. It's usually just where you haven't been yet. Though there are a few optional dungeons that you might find, they all at least have decent treasure in them. For the most part, it doesn't matter what character you pick, though differences crop up from time to time, such as only certain characters being allowed on a ship, making the others taking a long route. You could also choose to play the game solo for as long as you want, or totally and completely solo if you wish, though I don't personally recommend it, as there are some severe difficulty spikes. Overall, it's a fun and easy to play game. Notice that I said easy to play, not easy. That's the next section. For gameplay and controls, I give the 7th Saga a 7 out of 10. Finally, we have balance and difficulty. If you're playing an unpatched American version, there is no balance, only difficulty. The game hates you. And at the beginning, every battle is basically a boss, and even if you're not fighting the weakest enemy in the game, you'll die. You will have to stop and grind constantly, and due to the difficulty glitch also affecting your stat growth, but not the stat growth of other rival heroes, if you were betrayed and attacked by your partner, or attacked by one of the heroes in a town, you might as well just lie down and die. They are way, way more powerful than you, especially later in the game as their stat growth was calculated properly, while yours isn't. This is especially egregious for the one that will show up as a boss, basically meaning that some combinations of characters are just not workable. If I was reviewing the unpatched American version, I'd give it a damn 1 out of 10 for balance and difficulty. Thankfully, I'm reviewing the patched version. Essentially, the Japanese version. So that being said, stat growth works properly, rival battles wind up being balanced instead of impossible, and enemies, while fearsome, will not murder you right away. The game, however, still has a healthy challenge. It was never meant to be easy, it was meant to be playable. Your mileage may vary, however, depending on who you choose. There is a section that deprives you of all magic. I was playing as Wilmy, the alien who is so badass that he lights his fist on fire and punches enemies. He does gain some healing spells and some fire spells, but he's not super good at that, he mostly just attacks. He also can only ever use one weapon that is randomly dropped by an enemy, and he's naked without armor, so you can spend all the money you want on healing potions or stat boosts, which are very important in this game. That being said, the magicless section was a breeze for him. My companion, however, was the priestess, who has low attack and relies on ice magic to do damage, and can just use good healing spells. She was useless during this section. However, my alien dude carried her just fine. But if you're using 2 magic-based characters, this part could be a nightmare. It's important to know about things like this before you go in so you can make an informed choice as to who to play as, who to court as your possible companion. I'd say this throws the balance out of whack a bit, since your mileage will vary greatly depending not only on your personal choices, but randomness. If you're starting as one of the mages, you'll very much want a physically aggressive partner, but you might find them uninterested or hostile towards you. So at least a bit, you're relying on luck. That being said, the Japanese version, or the patched United States ROM, is a huge, gigantic improvement. In terms of balance and difficulty, I give it a 6 out of 10. So overall, your experience based on which version you play is going to vary a bit, or rather quite a bit. If I was to give a score for the unpatched US release, it would be 6 out of 10, an above average game that could have been a lot better, but hampered greatly by brutally punishing difficulty and a total lack of balance. But the Japanese version, or patched US version, winds up getting a 7, a full point higher, a good game that could be better with some tweaking. It's not often that a regional difference would change the final score by as much as a full point, especially considering I'm using a simple unweighted average, so that's something I find pretty interesting. Though if I was to weight the average, or at least just elaborate further on the score, I'd say to avoid the unpatched US version totally and completely. Although it has the same score for visuals, music, and story, the game is too hard to enjoy any of that. And had I been playing that version recently, the bad experience of trying to suffer through the game would have likely have soured my mood on it overall and lowered the score even more. With emulation and patching being a thing, there's really no reason to not play the patched version. And there's even ways to do it on original hardware if you have that particular fetish. But I can say that if you rented or otherwise tried this game back in the day and you had a bad time, it's definitely worth revisiting it with this patch.